And to speak on HTTPD. So I'd like to welcome, and at the end we'll have 10 minutes worth of Q&A. So I'd like to welcome the speaker, please.
I appreciate you all coming. This is a very intimidating room, so I can't see any of you. It's blinding, and I'm very hard of hearing, so if you have questions, please speak up. So I'm going to be talking about what's new in HTTPD 2.4. We released the first version of this. The first release of 2.4 came out back in February, and the 2.4.4 release was pushed out yesterday. So if I refer to 2.4.3 as the latest version in these slides, that's because that just happened yesterday. About 7.5 years ago in Stuttgart at ApacheCon, I gave a presentation called Why I Hate Apache. And I listed a bunch of things that really irritated me about the Apache web server. It was a very tongue-in-cheek talk, and every single thing that I mentioned in that presentation has been addressed in the 2.4 release. So I'm going to go through some of those things. Unfortunately, having only 45 minutes, I don't actually have time to cover everything in depth. It's a very compelling new release. If you have not yet upgraded to 2.4, I hope that by the end of this you'll be persuaded that it's the thing to do. So let's jump right in. Prior to 2.4, the MPM, the multi-processing module, was something that was very tightly bound up in how the build was done. And so if you wanted to switch from, say, a pre-fork MPM to a threaded MPM, you would have to reinstall the Apache server. There are several MPMs available. There's the pre-fork, which consists of a single parent and several single-threaded processes. The worker MPM consists of multi-threaded processes. And the big change with MPMs in 2.4 is that now you can build MPMs as shared objects. You can then load the one that you want at configure time with a load module option like any other module. So this is a significant change because before you had to decide ahead of time which MPM you wanted. If you wanted to experiment with another one, it was quite a bit of hassle. Now it's just a line of configuration. There are, of course, certain directives that are MPM specific, and so you do need to make sure that you actually test before you put it into production. It's not something that you can just throw out there and hope that it works. But it does give you the opportunity to switch between them as needed, or you can run multiple instances of the server on the same hardware pointing at different configurations using different MPMs. So that's very cool. The next feature that I have here is something that has been requested forever, and this is the ability to configure what your error log looks like and what information it logs. So previously you had the error log directive, and it told the server where to put your error log. And that was the extent of the control that you had over that error log. Now we have an error log format directive that looks very much like the log format directive. You can put many of the same variables in it, and then you can also put in some that are specific to the error condition. So in the example that I've got here, the %m out at the end there is the error message itself. In the default error log format, you'll have a %m, which shows the module that was responsible for generating the error condition. And here's a really nice new feature is the %L format. This allows you to correlate directly between an access log entry and the error log entry that was generated by it. So if you have a very busy site, you know that it's very difficult to figure out, looking at the error log, which access log entry went along with it. you can sort of correlate it by timestamp, but that's not good enough on an exceptionally busy site. So this gives you a log ID that you can tie those two entries directly together. Here's what a typical log entry looks like in the new format. This is the default format, and you can, of course, tweak this a little bit. You see that I've got the process ID that generated the message. I've got the module that was reporting the message. In this case, it was core. And then you have the client address that generated the message. Stating which module is responsible for it brings me to the next feature that is really compelling in 2.4, and that is the per module log level configuration. So here's how log level used to work, and you specify the level at which, the verbosity level at which you wish to have your log file. And this can be anything from debug all the way down to, what's at the other end? I guess critical is at the other end of the spectrum. And you can set this globally. This can be set once in your configuration or per virtual host in 2.2 and earlier. One of the downsides of this is if you want a greater verbosity on log messages for, say, mod include, then along for the ride you get a larger verbosity level for something like mod proxy, which just won't shut up. There's just so much debug information for mod proxy. And so this is something that has been improved in 2.4 in two ways. One is that you can specify log level per directory. And so in this configuration here, you can see that I've turned up the log level just for my CGI directory so I can get more information about what's going on there. But even more compelling is the ability to set log level per module. And in this example here, I've turned up the log level to warn on mod SSL, whereas it's only on info on everything else. Additionally, we've added several new log levels, and they are called trace 1 through trace 8, and this allows module authors to provide really detailed debug trace information to you, the end user, so you can figure out exactly what's going on when something goes wrong. One of the side effects of this is that the rewrite log, mod rewrite was one of the modules that provided its own dedicated log file. They had a rewrite log directive. That directive has gone away and is replaced by this per module configurable log level. If you want to pull out just the log messages relating to a particular module, you can simply pipe your log file through grep looking for a module name. Now, to me, this next thing is, from the server administrator's perspective, this is kind of the killer feature on 2.4. This is something that people have been requesting ever since I became involved with the Apache server project. People want some kind of configurable stuff in the Apache configuration file. There is a third-party module called mod macro that's provided something like this for a long time. And actually, I'll come back to mod macro a little bit later in this talk. Here is an example of using the if directive in your configuration file. And for anyone who's struggled with mod rewrite, isn't this better? You can simply have an if statement. And in this case, I'm saying, if somebody comes to my site using the hostname example.com, I want to require them to use www.example.com. It's legible. It's pretty clear just from looking at it what it means. And there aren't any nasty regular expressions floating around. Or, the other way around, If I want to say, if it's not example.com, send it to example.com. Same thing, other direction. You can also have a more detailed if-then-else structure in your configuration file. So I have, in this case, I have if the remote address, if the client address is in 10.1, then do this. If it's somewhere else in 10. Do this other thing. Otherwise, do this other thing, and that gets evaluated at request time. Of course, there is some request time overhead involved with this, but you were already doing that with mod rewrite, so it improves the maintainability of your configuration. So the upshot of this is that I need to write a new edition of my book, which I am working on in case you care. But mod rewrite is the bane of many system administrators, and this is a much easier way to do some of those things. In addition to the if function having expression evaluation, there is also a general purpose expression parser that can be used in other directives. And I think that this is the other killer feature, but I will mention once again that there is a request time overhead involved in using the expression parser. So one of the things that was frustrating in earlier versions of the server was that there were several different syntaxes for these kinds of comparison expressions. The situation was worse in 1.3. There was some consolidation in the 2.0 days. And there were two different species of regular expressions that you could use. And then there is also the sort of file glob foo.star syntax, which is actually still available in contexts where it makes sense. As a module author, you can now use this general purpose expression evaluation engine instead of rolling your own. It is amazingly flexible, and it supports all manner of logical expressions that you might want to put in a configuration directive. If you are interested in participating in documentation efforts, this is an area where we could use some help. We have a reference documentation on what the expression syntax looks like, but we're very light on actual examples of how you might use that in the real world. So if you do have examples of how you are using this, I'd love to talk to you to enhance that document. The expression engine can reference any variables that are accessible to the HTTPD runtime and use them use them at request time. So here's an example of using the expression engine to make sure that your website is only accessible during business hours. So we have require expression, and then we have an expression that says that the time hour needs to be greater than 9 and less than 17, putting it within your normal business hours, and that directory will then be inaccessible outside of those hours. This is a much more minor change, it seems. However, spending a lot of time on the Apache HTTPD IRC channel, it's amazing how many people get this wrong. And so for years, people would get this configuration syntax wrong, and we would beat them over the head with the documentation, until finally someone said, why don't we just do it easier so they don't make this mistake? So here is the configuration example that's being talked about here. You have a name virtual host directive, which says this interface, *:80, which means all IP addresses, port 80, requests over that interface should be treated as virtual host requests, and here are the virtual hosts that are configured for that interface. The trouble is that if you omit the name virtual host directive, or if you get the value, if the value in the name virtual host directive doesn't exactly match your virtual host blocks, then those virtual hosts might be ignored. Or you might get a warning message that says, you told me there were named virtual hosts on this interface, but there aren't, so I'm not going to run any of them. So why not just do the right thing if we already know what you meant? So here's what you do now. The name virtual host directive, if you happen to put it in there, great. If you don't, we'll do what you meant, and these virtual hosts will work the way that you expected them to in the first place. So there's a number of things that are like this, things where we've taken the addition, and I say we, and really it's several of the people that are sitting out there. I just write it down. Some of the people who actually do it are sitting in the audience here. And they've taken some of the cases where people were frustrated with how things work, and they've made it work the way that it was expected to work. So that's great. This slide intentionally left blank. I don't know what that's about. So anyway, there are cases where we're still not quite sure what you meant. If there is overlap between two virtual hosts, say two virtual hosts have the same host name on them, or maybe one of them has a wildcard host name that somehow is going to obscure another one with an overlapping host name, then we warn you about that at configuration time. We say, this overlaps, it probably won't do what you want, you might want to go check that. But we still try to do what we think you meant. Okay, override configuration. There is a feature in the web server called htaccess files. This allows you to put a configuration file per directory. And the directive that permits this is allow override. And you can specify allow override none, don't allow htaccess files. Allow override all, let people put whatever they want in htaccess files. Or you can specify categories. You can say allow override options, and the options category encompasses several directives that people can put in the htaccess file. And the case often happens when you want to allow people to override some things in a category but not other things. Oh, one other thing, the default for allow override has changed. This is a very good thing. It used to be that allow override all was the default, and now it's allow override none. I expect that this broke some configurations out there, but I tend to think that this was a good thing because htaccess files tend to be overused. So this will get people to look closer at their configuration. And anyway, we've introduced this new directive called allow override list. So you can combine an allow override directive, in this case authconfig, which allows authentication and authorization type directives. And then I also want to allow people to use redirect and redirect match, but not the entire scope of things that are in that particular category. So I just add those specific ones. Moving on to the next thing that people have been asking for 15 years. These are configuration file variables. And like I said, you've been asking for this forever. So we've added the define directive that allows you to set the value of a variable and then use that elsewhere in your configuration files. There are two different ways that you can use these variables. You can use the if-define directive, which has been around for a long time. The if-define directive allows you to put a block around the value of a variable. So we can say, I'm going to set the test variable to 1, and if that variable is set, I want to run my test configuration. Otherwise, I want to run my standard configuration. You can define a variable like this either by setting a variable in your configuration file using the define directive, or you can set it at the command line when you start the server up. by using httpd-d test. The other thing that you can do is you can set a variable using define and then use it later on in a configuration directive. So I've got a define server name, and then down at the bottom there, I'm using that server name variable in my document root. So if you look at the default configuration file now for 2.4, you'll see that we set the document root once in a define directive, and then we use that several times later on, once in a directory block and once in the document root, and to eliminate the repetition there, so you only have to change that one place. And that looks like this in the default 2.4 configuration file. You set the document root once, and then it gets applied to all the other places that you may have overlooked in the past. All right, I think I was a little nervous there at the beginning because I'm not doing so well on pacing, but hopefully you'll have lots of questions, right? The next thing that I want to talk about is mod heart monitor, and this slide indicates that I was confused as to the schedule. Jim is going to be giving a talk about proxy stuff in 2.4, and I presume he's going to be talking a little bit about mod heart monitor, right, Jim? Yes. Okay. So, in brief, mod heart monitor is a way to monitor between, and if he wasn't before, he's hastily writing those slides now. Mod heart monitor is a way to maintain a connection between a front-end proxy server and a back-end server that's being proxied to. So you have the heart monitor on the front end, you have the heartbeat on the back, and if the heart monitor ever ceases to hear the heartbeat, it takes that server out of the proxy rotation. And this gives you a way to bring servers up and down on the back end without affecting the end user's perception of the service. Speaking of talks that are coming up, there is a new module called Mod Lua, and I'm blinded by the lights. I think Daniel's here. Oh, Daniel stepped out for a moment. But Mod Lua embeds a Lua interpreter in your Apache web server, much like Mod Perl or Mod Python, and it allows you to develop applications using Lua to run on HTTPD. And he's going to be showing you some really cool stuff tomorrow afternoon. Mod rate limit answers a question that we get again on the IRC channel all the time. People want to slow down the throughput for a particular part of their website. So the scenario here is I have a downloads directory and people are downloading stuff so much from that directory that it's consuming all of my bandwidth and the rest of my site is inaccessible. So mod rate limit addresses this issue, and it slows down the bandwidth consumption for that particular directory, in this case to 400 kilobits per second, so that the rest of my website does not suffer. In a couple hours, I'm going to be talking at greater length about the access control changes in 2.4. The issue that was trying to be addressed here was that the old syntax using order and allow and deny and satisfy was incredibly confusing, but more importantly, it was very limiting. It limited how fine-grained your access control could actually be. And the new syntax completely does away with these old configuration directives and replaces it with a handful of require directives. So here's a simple example that says, I want to either require somebody to use get, post, or options, or they've got to log in. So I'm going to require any, which means one or more of these conditions is sufficient, and then I state my require directives. Here's a slightly more complicated example, which says I want to restrict access to this portion of my server based on the LDAP groups that I've got set up, and I want them to either be a super admin, or I want them to be either an administrator or in sales, and I don't want them to be a temporary employee. And I'm able to say that kind of complicated scenario in this, which, you know, it's a little bit ugly when you look at it at first, but as you start breaking down into its component parts and understanding each one, it's fairly clear and also was not possible before with the kind of fine-grained accuracy that you have now. So I will be talking more about that at 4 p.m. if you're interested in the details. Everybody's favorite module, Mod Rewrite, has a few small tweaks to it. There is a QSD flag that allows you to drop a query string. There's a new end flag that allows you to avoid looping in rewrite rules. The biggest change that is in Mod Rewrite is the ability to use SQL statements as part of a rewrite rule. So here's an example of using that. I've got a rewrite map that indicates, that specifies a SQL query, and the %s there is the requested URI, or whatever it is that I feed to it in my rewrite rule, and it does a database query, returns the response. You'll notice before the colon, there is the keyword fastDBD, and that indicates the type of rewrite map that's being defined. And there's two different ways to say this. One is by saying DBD, which does the database query at request time. Then there's fastDBD, which caches the result of that query, so that if you have data that's changing frequently, you want to do the request each time. If it doesn't change frequently, you want to cache it, and you get an enormous performance improvement based on that. The rotate logs utility comes with the server in order to rotate your logs. So all of you have modern operating systems that rotate your logs as one of the system services. However, when you rotate your Apache server log files, you have to restart the HTTPD process to get it to start logging to the new log file. And sometimes that's not acceptable if the restart time is too much. So we provide this rewrite logs utility that handles that for you as a piped log process. It can rotate your log files based on time or based on file size. And the syntax looks something like this. That line, that's all one line wrapped for the benefit of the slide. But you have a custom log directive that points at a piped log handler called rotate logs. In this particular case, I'm rotating my log every 86,400 seconds, which is 24 hours. And the -L flag solves a problem that users of the rewrite logs, the rotate logs utility have had for a long time, and that is that you never are quite sure what your log file is called. In this case, my command line there says, put my log file in var logs log file. But in reality, the log file is called logfile.unix timestamp. So when I want to go and look at my log files, I'm not really sure what my log file's called until I look at the directory and find the latest one. It's a bit of a hassle. But the -L flag is new in 2.4. It creates a hard symbolic link to the current log file, so I can just, so I know what my log file is called, basically. The other enhancement to the rotate logs utility is the ability to invoke something when the log file is rotated using the -p flag. If you have some sort of process that post-analyzes your log files, you can invoke that at the moment that you rotate your logs, for example. Earlier, I mentioned mod macro. Mod macro is one of those modules that when I give training classes, I invariably mention it as something that you should be using. It is a third-party module that allows you to put macros in your log file. And these macros are evaluated at startup time and allows you to create templatized configuration files. There we go. Just a month or so ago, a couple months ago, I guess, Mod Macro was donated to the web server project and is now part of Trunk. It's not yet in 2.4, is it? No, so it's not in 2.4 yet. Hopefully it will be someday. Right now it's just in Trunk, so eventually it'll be in 2.6, but at some point perhaps it will be in 2.4. And Mod Macro is an amazingly powerful module, so that made me very happy. Here's an example of using Mod Macro. You define a macro with one or more variables, and then you, with the use directive, you invoke that macro and you feed it variables. So in this particular case, I'm creating a directory block that has a certain authentication associated with it, and at server runtime, it'll take that macro block, it'll evaluate it, and it will generate these directory blocks. Now, someone pointed out to me yesterday that this can cause significant overhead at startup time. So it's not a magic bullet. It is, in fact, generating a configuration which is then executed or evaluated and loaded. So, but still, it is a very cool module. And that is pretty much the list of exciting new features in 2.4. There are other smaller things that I've probably neglected to mention, but there you have it. Are there any questions or comments? Yes, sir. Yeah. There's the URL for the slides. They are not there right now. They will be there a few minutes after I stop talking. Yes.
Is there going to be another talk? Sorry, I should have just looked on the event NPM. I thought that was actually the most compelling feature of 2.4.
So in 2.2 and earlier, the default NPM is pre-fork. And in 2.4 and later, the default NPM is determined based on your operating system capabilities. And what that means in the real world is that the default NPM in 2.4 is usually event. It's based on whether your operating system is able to handle polling and threads, and since most modern operating systems are, that means event is the default. There are still a few situations where you might want to use pre-fork. If you're running something that you're not sure about the thread safety of, you want to stick with pre-fork, but the event NPM is much more scalable and quite a bit faster, so we're glad to have that out there as the default now. Yes?
So can you say something about the gotchas from upgrading 2.2 to 2.4? Like, is there anything I need to worry about going from 2.2 to 2.4?
Upgrading from 2.2 to 2.4 can have some gotchas. We've tried to prevent some of the most obvious ones of that. The change in the the access control system is the one that's most likely to catch people. because it's a significant configuration change. And so there is a module called mod access compat, which allows you to continue using the old syntax as you upgrade. What would you say other gotchas are? I mean, that seems like the most obvious one to me. Yeah, so you'd need to check that third-party modules are still going to work for 2.4. But yeah, I think those would be the two biggest things. Yes? I'm sorry, I can't hear. Not sure that I have an answer for that. Jeff, you want to?
I had a couple of questions. Oh, sorry.
All right. We are recording the session, so if you could grab a microphone when you ask a question, that would be helpful. I can hear, but the speaker board can't.
I've got a couple of quick questions. First is, you mentioned defining variables. Can you redefine those sort of during parsing? So can you say my server name is this, do some things, now my server name is something else, or is that best done using macros?
Yes, so the question is, can you redefine a variable? And you can, and it gets used, the new value gets used from that point down. There's also a directive called, I think it's undefine, that completely unsets a value.
Okay, also for the rewrite map where you can execute a SQL query,
yes.
If you chose to cache that, is there a way to trigger a reload without doing like a SIG-hop or something like that?
No. In order to reload the cache, you would have to need to restart this process.
Okay, and finally for the directory-specific log level, is it possible, or are there any plans to support location-based log level rather than directory?
I think you can use that in location. So yeah, when we talk in the documentation about directory, it also includes location, proxy, and a number of other sections. Files, that's the other one. So yeah, that is already there.
Okay. Hi. A slightly odd question, but you showed us all these wonderful things that are in 2.4. We have lots of teams that are still running 2.2. When you guys are planning on end-of-lifing 2.2, can I use that as to give these teams a kick in the pants to go ahead and upgrade beyond the obvious advantages that you have here?
That kind of question tends to get a lot of debate when it comes up on the mailing list because we do have so many millions of sites that are still using 1.3. And when we finally declared that we were end-of-lifing 1.3, there were people that were anxious about that. The discussion is currently ongoing on and off about whether to end-of-life 2.0. And so the 2.2 discussion, on the one hand, from my opinion, it can't come soon enough, but there are a lot of people that would be upset by that. The other side of that answer is that the HTTPD project is volunteer-based, and people work on whatever they want to. And if people want to keep working on 2.2 forever, nobody's going to tell them not to. But in reality, nobody's working on it anymore, except for those few of us on the documentation team that are backporting docs patches. So in reality, it's sort of already end-of-lifed, but officially, it's still a product that we stand behind. Yes?
Just a little add-on to that. We also have a couple of people from distros who maintain packages. So those people are still invested in older products, especially if those distros have long-term support, such as Rahel and Ubuntu.
And on that note, let me answer a question that's been asked several times this week. Fedora, I believe, is the only Linux distribution that's currently shipping 2.4. So far as the Linux world goes, 2.2 is still the de facto version unless you intentionally upgrade.
The configuration file variables, is that basically taking over the functionality of the third-party module mod-define?
You know, I don't know that I've ever used mod-define, but based on the name, I would say yes, it's the same thing.
It seems, from your examples, it seems that it is.
Okay.
And I'm curious about the interactions between that, which I guess is part of the core now,
Yeah.
and mod macro. Say, for example, you define a macro that's got 6 variables, and when you invoke it, you only specify the first 3.
Yeah.
Would it draw the remaining 3 from anything that might have been defined as a configuration file variable? In other words, being able to set a bunch of defaults and then only define the ones that are necessary for you. Obviously, the syntax requires it to be positional, but
And there are overlaps between it simply because they're using similar syntax.
right. I noticed the syntax is different from the mod define syntax.
Oh, okay.
I think.
But the syntax between this and mod macro are the same. Mod macro has conventions that you might want to follow.
Right.
If I can find that slide again. So mod macro has conventions that you put a $sign in front of it,
Right.
but you don't have to. You can also put a $sign and curly braces around it, but you don't have to. And what we're leaning towards recommending, I think what we recommend in the documentation is that you adhere to those guidelines that are not requirements, but to differentiate between the two. But yeah, you can run into situations where you step on your own variables if you're not careful.
Okay.
So using the undefined is a good idea to drop a variable when you think it's going to go out, when you're no longer needing it.
So yesterday we spoke about how it's sometimes more efficient to put certain rewrite rules in a rewrite map. But the disadvantages with the rewrite map, it may crash the instance upon a restart, or when you push the new map file, Apache loads the rewrite map automatically. So how do you prevent like a typo or some kind of syntax error from causing the Apache server to crash with a rewrite map?
Yeah. So the context in which I made that comment was specifically about trying to remember, was talking about rewrite map using the PRG syntax where you're invoking an external process to act as the rewrite map. But I suppose that the problem is broader than that. If
Not
you
even
don't.
with PRG, just using regular text rewrite map, or even maybe a SQL rewrite map.
Yeah, rewrite map lets you reference a plain text file with a one-to-one mapping, or it lets you reference an external program that can provide that mapping functionality. And it's in that latter case where you can end up in a situation where that external program has crapped out for whatever reason, and the HTTPD process doesn't notice and starts getting bogus data back from the nothing that's there. I tend to not recommend using that feature on production servers. Use it as a quick prototyping, a quick fix kind of thing before you have a real solution. But I guess you could maybe get into the same situation with the DBD one if your database went away. I'm not sure what would happen to those mapping queries. I'd have to try that.
Okay.
So I guess you need to monitor your database server pretty closely to prevent that kind of thing from happening.
But like even text errors in the text files, is there any way to syntax check those, like a check config? Would a check config check if a map file exists on disk? Or
If you're using a text map file, then on startup, it's going to parse that file, and it's going to throw an error message on startup if the syntax is incorrect in that file.
Right, but if you have like a cluster of Apache servers and you update the
You
text
update the file.
locally and you push it out to production,
Yeah.
the Apache process checks the disk, sees that the timestamp was updated, and loads a
Yeah.
new file, finds a syntax error, and it might crash. So if there's any way to prevent that, that would be nice.
I'm not aware of one other than being vigilant. If you convert that text file to a DBM and use a DBM instead, then that conversion process does syntax check the file. So that might be the best way to do that, and it gives you the added performance benefit of the DBM.
Okay. All right, thank you.
All right. Any more questions? Great.
Just one quick one. Are there performance benefits as far as shorter code path to using if instead of mod rewrite? Because I see a lot of overlap in functionality.
The performance is going to be comparable. The benefit is the maintenance efficiency, the ability to actually read what your configuration file says. There are cases where one or the other is going to be more efficient at runtime, but both of those things, the if statements are evaluated per request, so there is some overhead there. Mod rewrite does some optimization, like pre-compiling the regular expressions at startup, so there's a little bit more efficiency there. So it very much depends on the specific scenario that you're using it for.
Okay, so we're actually, we plan to finish up here, I think, at 1:15, so we have some time. I'm sure you can catch up with Rich, so I'd like to thank Rich anyway for his presentation, and we have the next presentation on Tomcat at 1:15. So thank you, Rich.
Thank you. Ran out of content too quickly. I hate that. Yes. Yes.
And do you have the video adapter? Sure. Okay. Yep. what are you presenting? What do you need?
Presenting from there, and I need whatever I need to connect to
What
whatever
have you?
I need to display for.
Think
Oh, you've got them all.
it's a new laptop, so if that's what you want.
Are you the one presenting next?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think you're next, and then there's lunch, and then I'm after that. So.
Right, excellent. Well, I'm here after you, so I'm happy for this just to be left on the lectern, just to make sure it doesn't go
Okay.
walkies.
Sure. You'll still be in this room after lunch.
Yes, so I think I'm
So I'll make sure I don't walk out.
Yeah.
That would be awesome. If
Yeah.
I could borrow that. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Actually, tell you what, come and grab me at the end of my talk. If you then take that, I know it's safe.
Okay.
You can do your presentation. I'm after lunch as well doing a clustering talk, so I can grab it off you.
Oh, you have a
then.
second talk.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So as long as it's back for my clustering talk, I'm happy.
Great. Thank you so much.
Not at all.
All right, when I come back and switch to you, make sure you
Oh yeah, this thing.
when you're ready. I mean, if it's there, we can keep doing it.
Let me just check. Okay, well, it claims to have found the display and it claims to be sending to it. Let's give it a go. Yeah, we're good to go. Yeah. It's doing that. Okay, yeah, I'll fix that in a sec. I'm just making sure. Right, go back to the displays and mirror them. Displays, arrangement, Okay, and I think we're going to need to play with the resolutions, aren't we? Oh, no, it should be all right, actually. Yeah.
So that looks good.
Happy
You're
days.
good with same thing on both screens.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fine.